does it then mean, brothers and sisters, when we couple the word godly with nation? Let us think about the definition of a Christian for a moment as we ponder the relationship between the two words. It's even easier to understand if you think about it what it means to be a Christian, and you want to look at the context of a Christian nation. The most facile definition for our purposes of a Christian, or someone who is godly, is someone who follows God. Were we to leave it there, we would be stuck in a circular loop. Fortunately, Jesus knew this and therefore clarified what it meant to be one of his disciples at the time, but also to be a godly person. He admonished his followers then, and us now, through the written account of his words, that if we are to love God, then we are to keep his commandments. Now, I would like to replace the word love with follow because I feel that it more fully reflects the nature of our relationship that Christ wished to establish with those who followed his teachings at the time, who adhere to the teachings of the Bible, and who adhere to the teachings of any sacred text. It was one of love as its foundation. Now, there are several scriptures that I believe we can utilize throughout our conversation. The first one helps us to understand what it means to be a nation. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. We have come to understand that we are Caesar. However, each one of these relates back to what I believe to be the central principle as enunciated in the first scripture. Love thy neighbor as thyself. The second scripture we must allow ourselves to experience as a departure point for our journey is found a little earlier in Matthew's as well. Jesus was queried by the Pharisees. You remember them? They were the ruling class, many rabbis, very formal, very legalistic, and they sought to trick him on the great law or commandment. In answering the Pharisees, Jesus articulated the essential core of the very first commandment. You remember back to Exodus or Genesis, right? The Ten Commandments. Following me here on this one? Yeah, the very first commandment, love the Lord thy God. Well, Jesus went back to that commandment to make his point. And he said unto them, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second like unto it is this. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments the whole law hangeth, and the prophets. Sisters and brothers, in those 3 verses, a mere 59 words, Jesus gave us an entire gospel. I realize that it is a rather large claim to make, so please allow me to explain. Jesus used the language of the Old Law, the Old Testament, the first commandment, one with which his listeners were no doubt familiar. I mean, they were Pharisees, they were the learned class, a lot of rabbis, to explain the new law which Jesus was bringing. To make the laws clear, Jesus uses language that equates the two laws to each other. The words like unto it are the key here. Jesus makes it clear that the only way to fulfill the greatest commandment to love God is to fulfill the second commandment to love your neighbor. When Jesus equates these two laws, he makes explicit between them the relationship that exists between loving God and loving your neighbor. Brothers and sisters, to love God is a pretty big commandment. I mean, loving your neighbor is a bit easier to understand, but far from simple. However, I think that if we take a few obvious examples, it will be easier to understand who your neighbor is and what it means to love them. The first obvious question that we must ask ourselves when we apply these scriptures is just who exactly is my neighbor? Right? Who is my neighbor? For today's discussion, I want to stick with a very simple definition of neighbor, one that you are no doubt familiar with. Your neighbor is the person that lives next to you, behind you, or down the block. Our neighbors are the people that we interact with every day. We shop at the same stores. We should even shop at our neighbors' stores. Our children go to the same schools. These are our neighbors. Keeping this definition in mind, putting together the idea of what it means to love your neighbor becomes easier. If your neighbor needed food and you knew it, if you have and give, that is an act, an example of loving your neighbor, an individual act. If your neighbor has fallen on hard times and you pay him or his kids to mow your lawn a decent wage so that you can have a little bit of extra, that's an act of loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor is not one big thing that you can do and be done with to fulfill the second great commandment. No. Loving your neighbor is made up of small, daily, individual acts, over and over again, repeated with all people that you interact. These individual acts are examples of loving your neighbor, getting along with your neighbor. Being nice, accepting differing points of view is all part of loving your neighbor. And it is through these continuously repeated acts of love and charity, one to another, that add up to loving your neighbor. By recognizing and enacting this relationship between our individual acts, we are then able to fulfill the first commandment and love God. Now that we have a better understanding of what it means to love God through loving your neighbor and what it means to be a nation, it's time to consider the two together. Time to consider the phrase godly nation, or Christian nation if you prefer. It doesn't really require that we go back to high school English class to understand this one. A nation that is godly will act in a godly fashion. Now, we learned previously what it means to act godly. If we're going to love God, follow God, then we must love our neighbor. A nation that is a godly nation will act in a godly fashion. A godly nation will love God by loving its neighbors. Just as you and I individually have neighbors, so too does our nation. And just because people are not within our physical presence does not mean that they are not our neighbor. Remember, we are all part of this nation. Our collective voice as a nation is made up together to form this country, who we are as Americans. Therefore, everyone, all voices within this community are our neighbor. We have a responsibility to them. Therefore, it is not possible for us to say, when the government does something with which we disagree, or when the government engages in programs to take care of individuals who are fallen by the wayside, then we do not have the right to say that there is no responsibility lying within me to either avoid those things that are sins or to help take care of those, because that is the government. You are the government. You are Caesar. We are Caesar. We are American. We don't get a free pass anymore.